They locked the barn door from the outside. That was the part Eliza Harper could never quite explain to people afterward. Not the cold, not the blood, not the hours she spent screaming into darkness that swallowed every sound whole. It was that small, deliberate click of a padlock snapping shut that broke something open in her chest and never fully closed again. She had trusted them. That was her mistake. She had believed, for one foolish, desperate hour, that belonging was something that could be earned. She was wrong. If you've ever been the person in the room that everyone pretends not to see, if you know what it feels like to want so badly to fit in that you'll do almost anything, even the things that feel wrong in your stomach before you agree to them, then you already understand Eliza Harper better than most people in Red Hollow ever did. Stay with this story. If it moves you, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we share here don't let go easily. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The town of Red Hollow sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines that caught wind like a funnel, and in November, that wind had teeth. It came down off the northern hills in the early evening and didn't let up until well past midnight, rattling window glass, pulling at roof shingles, pushing dust under door frames in thin brown lines. The people who'd been born there didn't notice it anymore. The people who'd arrived recently, and there weren't many of those, noticed nothing else for the first several weeks. Eliza Harper had been in Red Hollow for 22 days when the girls at the Whitmore boarding house first invited her to join them for supper at the long table in the front parlor rather than eating alone in her room. She almost didn't go. She stood at her door for a full minute with her hand on the knob, listening to their voices drift up from below. The easy laughter, the back and forth of people who had been friends long enough that they could finish each other's sentences. And she felt the familiar pull of two opposing forces, the need to be near other people, and the fear of what happened when you got too close. She'd learned that particular lesson early. Some children are born into families that teach them the world is basically safe, and some are born into situations that teach them the opposite. Eliza had been the latter. Her mother died of fever when Eliza was 4. Her father remarried, and his new wife was not a cruel woman exactly, but she was a woman with her own children and her own burdens, and Eliza was neither her responsibility nor her concern. By the time Eliza was 12, she understood that she was tolerated rather than loved, and there is a considerable difference between those two things that no child should have to learn so young. By 16, she was working. By 19, she was saving. By 23, she had enough to relocate to a new town and start something that resembled, if not a life, at least the rough outline of one. Red Hollow wasn't her first choice. It wasn't anyone's first choice. But it had a dry goods store with a position open for a bookkeeper, and the owner, a man named Pratt, had responded to her letter quickly and without asking too many questions about her family or her connections or her past. She took that as a good sign. She was still young enough to mistake efficiency for kindness. She went downstairs that evening and ate supper with the women of the boarding house. There were 4 of them at the table that night. Margaret Calloway sat at the head. She was 26, the daughter of the town's largest landowner, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life been made to feel small. She had copper-red hair and a sharp, pretty face, and a laugh that could fill a room, and also, Eliza would learn, a gift for precision cruelty that she had spent years refining into something she could deploy with a smile. Beside her sat Frances Pryor and Ada Nichols, who orbited Margaret the way smaller bodies orbit something with greater mass, close enough to benefit from her warmth, careful enough to never cross her gravity. At the end of the table was Ruth Sayers, who was the quietest of the 4, and the one who laughed at Margaret's jokes a half second after everyone else, as though she was always checking the room before committing to a reaction. They welcomed Eliza with smiles and passed her the breadbasket first, and asked her where she'd come from and what she thought of Red Hollow so far. She told them. She was honest. Perhaps more honest than she should have been with women she'd just met. But loneliness does that to people, opens doors in them that good sense would otherwise keep shut. She told them about the bookkeeping position and about arriving in a town where she knew nobody, and she told them, carefully and without too much detail, that she didn't have much family to speak of. She watched their faces as she said it, looking for the flicker of judgment or pity that usually accompanied that particular admission. Margaret Calloway just nodded as though she'd heard similar things before, which she probably had, and said, "Well, you're here now," and smiled again. It was a small thing to say. It shouldn't have meant much. But Eliza had been a long time without anyone saying anything even close to it, and the plain warmth of those 3 words settled over her like something she hadn't known she was cold without. She was careful with herself after that. She told herself she barely knew these women. She told herself not to get attached too quickly, not to read more into shared suppers and brief exchanges in the hallway than was actually there. She was good at telling herself sensible things. She was less good at making herself believe them. Over the following 2 weeks, she ate with them most evenings. She learned that Francis was engaged to a banker's son and couldn't stop talking about the wedding, that Ada had opinions about everything and frequently stated them, that Ruth had a younger sister she was clearly worried about for reasons she never fully explained. She learned that Margaret's father owned half the grazing land in the eastern part of the county, and that Margaret herself had turned down 2 marriage proposals, from men she described as perfectly adequate, which is exactly the problem. She was funny when she wanted to be. That was the thing that made her dangerous. She was genuinely funny, and when she decided to make you feel included, she was very good at it. Eliza let herself relax. Just a little, just enough. The invitation came on a Wednesday evening. They were all in the parlor after supper, the lamp burning low, Ada complaining about the cold, Frances showing the others a piece of Belgian lace she'd ordered from a catalog for the wedding, when Margaret leaned back in her chair and said she'd heard something interesting about old Cole Varden. Eliza didn't know the name yet. She said so. The others exchanged looks. Not the quick, readable kind, the other kind, where something passes between people that the person watching isn't meant to catch, Margaret explained. Cole Varden was a rancher. He owned a stretch of land about 4 miles north of town, up past the Callaway grazing boundary, running toward the hills. He'd lived out there alone for, Frances said 7 years. Ada said more like 9. They didn't settle on a number. Long enough that most people in town had never actually spoken to him. He came in for supplies twice a year, maybe. He didn't stop to talk. He kept to himself with a thoroughness that people in small towns always interpreted as hostility, and so they returned it in kind. And over the years, the stories about Cole Varden had accumulated the way stories do when nobody is there to contradict them. They said he'd driven his wife away. They said he'd once pulled a gun on a surveyor who wandered too close to his fence line. They said he was half out of his mind from years of solitude, that he kept the barn locked at all times, that anyone who trespassed on his land didn't come back the same. Eliza listened to all of this and thought that most of it sounded like the kind of thing bored people said about someone they didn't understand. She'd been the subject of enough small-town talk herself to recognize the shape of it. There's a tradition, Margaret said then, in the particular tone she used when she was framing something to sound lighter than it was, for women new to the boarding house, a kind of welcome, a way of proving you belong. Eliza looked at her. What kind of tradition? Nothing dangerous, Ada said quickly, which was, Eliza recognized only much later, the first real warning. People who preface things with nothing dangerous have already considered the possibility. Margaret smiled. Just a dare. Just one night in Cole Varden's old barn. You go in, you stay until sunrise, you come back. That's all. Then you're one of us. Properly. The barn, Margaret explained, was never locked. Cole Varden used the new one closer to the cabin. The old structure at the east edge of his property was just a leftover thing, sagging and empty. Technically on his land, but far enough from the main buildings that no one had ever bothered with it. It was nothing, really, just a building, just a night. Eliza should have said no. She knew it in the way she knew most things. Not as a thought exactly, but as a physical sensation, a tightening low in her chest that her body used to signal what her brain was still negotiating. She had felt that sensation before and overridden it before, and the outcomes had been various. She said yes. She told herself it was practical. She needed these women on her side. Red Hollow was a small town, and she was going to be living here, and Margaret Calloway's goodwill was the kind of social currency that had real-world value. She told herself it was just a building. She told herself she wasn't afraid of the dark or the cold or being alone, and she was right about 2 of those things. She didn't tell herself the truth, which was simpler and harder. She wanted to belong somewhere, and this was the price of entry, and she was willing to pay it. They went out after 10 o'clock. Margaret had borrowed horses from her father's stable, which told Eliza, later, that this had been planned for longer than one evening. You didn't borrow horses on a whim for a spontaneous dare. They rode north in a group, the cold settling into Eliza's coat within the first 10 minutes, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself loudly, but instead moves inward through layers, patient and systematic. Margaret led. The others talked in low voices. Eliza rode near the back and watched the landscape flatten and then rise toward the hills, and tried not to think about the tightening in her chest, which had not gone away since she agreed to this. They found the barn by moonlight. It was a large structure, or had been once. The boards had warped and grayed, and one section of the roof had partially collapsed at some point, leaving a gap that let in cold and weather and whatever else. A wide door faced east, hanging unevenly on rusted hinges. There was a padlock on it, old, heavy, the kind that doesn't yield easily. Eliza stopped her horse. "I thought you said it was never locked." "It usually isn't," Margaret said. She was already dismounting. She walked to the door and gave the padlock a look, and then said, in the same pleasant tone she used for everything, "The lock must be broken. It's not actually fastened. See?" And she lifted the padlock to show the shackle was open, hung it back, and pulled the door wide. The inside was darkness and cold, and the smell of old hay and rot. Eliza looked in and said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to," Ruth Sayers said from beside her. It was the first time Ruth had spoken in an hour. Her voice was flat in a way that didn't match the words, and Eliza heard the flatness, but assigned it to the cold. "I'm fine," Eliza said. She dismounted and walked to the door and went inside. She stood in the dark and heard them moving outside. She heard the door close. She heard the particular sound, small, final, mechanical, of a padlock being snapped shut. She did not understand for a full 3 or 4 seconds what that sound meant. Her mind offered her several explanations before it landed on the correct one. Then she went to the door and pushed, and the door didn't move, and she pushed again with her shoulder, and the door shuddered, but the chain held, and outside she heard something she had not expected. Laughter. Not all of them. Frances, definitely. Ada. Margaret's voice, cutting above the others. "You stay till morning now, orphan girl. That's the rule." And then the sound of hooves, retreating, going south, getting quieter, and then nothing. Eliza stood with her hands pressed flat against the door and breathed through her nose and waited for something in her to know what to do next. She pulled her hands back and turned around and tried to find the dimensions of the space around her. Her eyes were adjusting. The gap in the roof let in a panel of thin moonlight that didn't reach far, but was better than nothing. She could see the rough shape of the space. Large, mostly empty, a few old stanchions along one wall, a scatter of boards and broken equipment. The floor was dirt and packed straw, and something she didn't look at too carefully. She walked the perimeter. There was no other door. The gap in the roof was 20, maybe 25 feet up, and the walls offered no obvious handholds. One wall had boards loose enough to possibly work free given time, and something to pry with, but she had no tools and her hands were already losing feeling. She found a corner that was marginally sheltered from the worst of the wind coming through the roof gap, and sat down against the wall and wrapped her coat tighter and thought, clearly and without sentiment, about her situation. She was locked in a barn on the property of a man reputed to be unstable and hostile, 4 miles from town, in November, with no way to signal anyone and no certainty that anyone would look for her even if they could. The women who had left her here knew where she was. They might come back in the morning. They might not. She did not know enough about their characters yet to predict which was more likely. And she was honest with herself about that uncertainty. She was also, she became aware, injured. At some point in the scramble, she'd taken a fall she didn't fully remember, perhaps in the dark when she'd rushed the door, perhaps on the way in, and her left leg had taken the edge of something, a board, the door frame, she wasn't sure. It wasn't unbearable, but it was bleeding. She could feel the wet warmth of it through her stocking, which in this cold was a problem that would compound if she couldn't do something about it soon. She tore a strip from her underskirt and pressed it against the wound and held it there and stared at the thin beam of moonlight coming through the roof. She was 23 years old, and she had come to Red Hollow to start something new, and she was sitting alone in a locked barn bleeding through an improvised bandage, and the temperature was still dropping, and she did not cry. That was not a point of pride exactly. She had simply learned a long time ago that crying cost energy she couldn't always spare, and in the present situation the math was clear. What she felt instead was something older and more complicated than grief, a tired, bone-deep recognition. She had been here before. Not in this barn, not in this precise cold, but in this essential position, trusting someone and being wrong about them, lowering a guard she'd raised over years and having that decision cost her in ways that took a long time to stop costing. She knew the shape of this feeling the way you know the shape of an old scar. You don't forget it. You just hope it stops finding you. She thought about Ruth Sayers saying you don't have to, and the flatness in Ruth's voice when she said it, and she thought about that for a long time. The cold deepened. She moved her hands and feet regularly to keep the blood in them and shifted position every 20 minutes or so and paid attention to her breathing, which was the one thing she could control. The wound on her leg was worse than she'd initially assessed. Not dangerous, she didn't think. Not yet, but enough to make standing painful and walking a real problem if it came to it. Around what she estimated was 2 or 3 in the morning, she heard a noise that was not the wind. It was outside. Something moving, methodical, and unhurried. The sound of someone who knew their land well enough to move across it in the dark without hesitation. She went still. She heard it approach the barn and then stop at the door, and then a voice, rough and male, and not quite angry but not far from it, said, "Who's in there?" She didn't answer immediately. Everything she'd been told about Cole Varden ran through her head in a fast, unhelpful loop. The voice came again, harder this time. "I heard you. I can hear you breathing. Who's on my property?" And Eliza Harper, sitting in the corner of a freezing barn with a bleeding leg and no good options, called back, "My name is Eliza Harper. I didn't come here by choice. The door is locked from the outside." A silence. Then the sound of the padlock. Then the door swung open and cold air rushed in, and in the thin frame of moonlight stood a man she'd never seen before. Broad-shouldered, hatless despite the cold, holding a lantern he must have brought from the cabin, its light swinging forward into the barn and finding her against the far wall. He stood there and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. His face in the lantern light was not what she'd expected from the stories. Not wild, not manic, just tired and guarded and trying to read a situation he hadn't anticipated. "You're hurt," he said finally. "Yes," she said. He didn't say anything else. He crossed the barn in 6 strides, set the lantern down, and crouched in front of her to look at her leg, and his face when he looked at it told her it was worse than she'd been allowing herself to think. He stood back up and looked at the door and looked at her, and she could see him calculating something. Probably the same thing she would have calculated in his position, which was whether this was a trap and how likely that was, and what the cost of being wrong in either direction would be. "Can you walk?" he said. "If I have to." "My cabin's closer than town." She looked at him. In the stories they told in Red Hollow, Cole Varden was the danger. He was the reason the dare existed, the reason the barn was supposed to be frightening. He was the monster at the edge of the known world. And here he was, crouched in a cold barn with a lantern, asking if she could walk. And the only thing she could find in his face was a weary kind of decency that people who have been through difficult things sometimes carry without knowing it. "All right," she said. He helped her up. His grip was firm and impersonal and careful. The grip of someone who'd worked with injured animals long enough that the instinct transferred. She put her weight on the bad leg and winced, and he adjusted without comment, taking more of her weight on the one side, and they went out through the barn door into the cold night air together. Behind them, the barn door swung in the wind. The padlock lay in the dirt where he'd dropped it. She looked back at it once. Just once. Then she turned forward and kept walking. He didn't ask her anything on the walk to the cabin. That was the first thing she noticed about Cole Varden that separated him from the version of him she'd been given by other people. Most men in her experience filled silence with questions, sometimes out of genuine curiosity, sometimes out of the need to establish control over a situation that had surprised them. Cole did neither. He walked beside her with the lantern in his left hand and his right arm steady where she leaned against it, and he watched the ground ahead of them and said nothing, and somehow the silence was not unfriendly. It was just silence, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you. The cabin was maybe a quarter mile from the barn. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 rooms visible from outside, solid construction, the kind of building put up by someone who intended to stay and built accordingly. A covered porch ran the length of the front. A stack of firewood along the south wall reached nearly to the eave. Light came through the front window, which meant he'd had a fire going before he came out. He hadn't been sleeping then, or hadn't been sleeping well. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it. He got the door open and helped her across the threshold and steered her toward a chair near the fireplace without asking her preference, which was fine because she didn't have one, and the fire was what mattered. The warmth hit her in a physical wave, and she hadn't realized until that moment how thoroughly cold had gotten into her. Not just her skin, but something deeper, the kind of cold that makes the muscles slow and the thinking imprecise. She sat down and held her hands out toward the fire and tried to take stock of herself. Her leg had stiffened on the walk over. The makeshift bandage she'd tied with her underskirt was soaked through and had dried partially against the wound, which would be a problem when it needed to come off. Her hands were functional, but clumsy. She was, she assessed, not in serious danger, but she was not well, and she was in a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night, and whatever happened next was largely out of her control. Cole set the lantern on the table and moved to a shelf near the back wall without looking at her. She heard him moving things, opening something, a wooden box, by the sound, and then he came back with a cloth and a brown glass bottle and knelt down in front of her without ceremony and looked at her leg. "This is going to hurt," he said. "I know." He unwrapped what she'd tied there, and she kept her eyes on the fire and did not make a sound, though the unwrapping of dried cloth from a wound is its own specific category of unpleasant and requires a certain amount of concentration to endure quietly. He worked carefully. That was another thing she noted. He didn't rush, didn't tear, and when she tensed, he paused without being asked to. Not because he was trying to be kind, she thought, but because he was methodical, and hurrying through that kind of thing makes it worse, and he knew it. "How'd this happen?" he asked. His eyes were on the wound. "I think the door frame, when I went in, or when I tried to get out. I don't remember exactly." He didn't respond to that. He poured some of the bottle's contents onto the cloth and pressed it against the wound, and she pulled in a sharp breath through her nose and held it. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls with its flat, persistent pressure. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, which was what people said when something was bad enough to require comment, but not bad enough to justify panic, and she recognized the precise calibration of it. "I know." He wrapped it properly with a clean strip of cloth, actual bandaging material, not improvised, and tied it off and sat back on his heels and looked at her for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. In the firelight, she could see his face more clearly than she'd been able to outside. He was older than she'd thought, or weathered to look it. Somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had spent years in outdoor light and didn't try to hide it. A jaw that needed shaving, eyes that were dark and watchful in a way that wasn't hostile exactly, but was very much accustomed to assessing things quickly and revising assessments as new information arrived. He was looking at her the same way she imagined she was looking at him, trying to read a situation that didn't fit any template he'd prepared for. "Who locked you in there?" he said. She considered how to answer that. "Women from the boarding house in town. It was presented to me as a dare, a tradition for newcomers." She paused. "I don't think it was actually a tradition." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected about the world. "You're new to Red Hollow," he said. 22 days. He stood up and took the bloody cloth and the bottle back to the shelf. "They do that to everyone who's new, or just you?" She thought about the way they'd talked about her before she'd agreed, the name they'd used just before they rode away. Orphan girl. "Just me, I think." He came back and poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and set it on the arm of her chair without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up and drank. He moved to the other chair across the fireplace and sat down, and for a moment they were just two people in a warm room in the middle of the night, not talking. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "The leg needs rest." "I'm not sure I can." "Try anyway." He stood and moved toward the back room and stopped in the doorway. "I'll be here." She wasn't sure what exactly he meant by that, whether it was meant to be reassuring or simply informational, but she was tired enough that she didn't pursue the question. She stayed in the chair and let the fire work on her bones and closed her eyes and did not expect to sleep. And then she did. She woke to gray light coming through the front window and the sound of someone moving quietly in the other room, the considered movements of a person trying not to disturb something. Her leg ached with a deep, settled pain that told her she'd slept long enough for the initial shock to wear off, and the real injury to announce itself properly. She shifted in the chair and took stock. Still in the cabin. Fire had burned low, but the room was still warm. Through the window, the sky was the particular flat gray of early winter morning, not yet fully light. Cole came through from the other room with 2 plates and set one on the small table beside her without comment. Bread and something that had been cooked. Beans, she thought, and something with them that she didn't identify immediately, but that smelled like it had been made with actual care. He took his own plate to the opposite chair and sat down. She looked at the plate and then at him. "You cooked." "I was up anyway. Did you sleep at all?" He ate a bite before answering. "Some." She picked up the fork he'd left on the plate, a plain, heavy thing, the kind that lasted, and ate, because she was genuinely hungry, and also because refusing food from someone who'd just carried you out of a locked barn in the dark would have been a strange kind of ingratitude. It was plain food, the kind made without any attempt to be more than it was, and it was good. They ate in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence, which she found interesting, given everything. "The stories about you in town," she said eventually. "I want you to know I didn't put much weight in them." He looked at her. "What stories?" "That you're dangerous. That you drove your wife away. That you pulled a gun on a surveyor." She held his gaze. "I've been the subject of enough town talk to know it doesn't require much accuracy to spread." He was quiet for a moment. "The surveyor walked my fence line with a county official and a piece of paper that said my east pasture belonged to James Calloway. I had my own deed. I showed it to them. They didn't want to see it." He ate another bite. "I didn't pull a gun. I held the paper up. People see what they're ready to see." She thought about that. "Calloway. Margaret Calloway's father?" His eyes changed, just slightly, a narrowing, a reassessment. "You know Margaret." "I live in the same boarding house." She paused. "Or I did." "She was one of the ones last night." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "She organized it. I think the others followed her." He set his plate down on his knee and looked at the fire. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through something, pulling something back that wanted out, and she recognized the effort because she made that same effort herself regularly. The effort of not saying the thing that would feel good to say and would accomplish nothing afterward. "Margaret Calloway," he said, with a flatness that contained multitudes, "has been trying to make my life difficult for 4 years. Her father wants my east pasture for the water access. The creek runs through it." He shook his head slowly. "This is a different approach. Using me to get at you? Or just sport?" He picked his plate back up. "Probably both." Eliza looked at her hands. She thought about Margaret's face the evening she'd first come downstairs for supper. Warm and attentive, and so convincing. She thought about the way belonging had felt, briefly, like something real before it turned out to be a prop. She was not surprised exactly. She was tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. "I need to go back to town," she said. "I have work. I have a position with Pratt's Dry Goods." "Not today." She looked at him. "That leg doesn't walk 4 miles today," he said, in the same tone he'd used for everything. Not harsh, not gentle, just direct. The tone of someone who'd operated alone long enough that he'd stopped padding things. "You can take my horse tomorrow morning if it's better. If it's not, day after." She wanted to argue. The instinct was strong, not because she disagreed with him, because she didn't. His assessment was correct and she knew it, but because she'd spent years maintaining a particular kind of independence that required never being in a position where she needed something from someone. That independence had kept her upright through a lot. It had also kept her alone. "All right," she said. He nodded and finished eating and took both plates back to the other room, and she heard water running, him washing up, and she sat with the fire and thought about what the day ahead looked like, and decided not to think past it. She stayed 2 nights in the end, because the first morning the leg was worse rather than better, and walking on it would have risked something neither of them wanted to deal with. He gave her the bedroom and slept in the main room on what appeared to be a cot he kept folded against the wall, deployed without discussion and without making any point about it. She didn't thank him for it, and he didn't seem to expect her to. They existed in this cabin alongside each other with the careful courtesy of 2 people who were both accustomed to solitude and found, unexpectedly, that sharing a space with the right kind of quiet person was less disruptive than they'd anticipated. He worked during the days. She could hear him outside, chopping wood, moving between the buildings, doing the constant maintenance that a working ranch in November demanded. He came in at midday for a brief meal and again at dark, and those were the times they talked, if talk was the right word for the particular exchange they'd developed. Not conversation exactly, more like two people occasionally adding information to the same shared picture without trying to direct what the other person did with it. She learned, over those meals, that he had come to Red Hollow 11 years ago from Kansas, that he had built the cabin himself with a man named Guthrie, who'd since moved on to Oregon, that the ranch ran cattle on the western pasture, and that the east pasture was, as he'd said, primarily valuable for the creek. He did not talk about his wife. She did not ask. There were obviously things in his history that he'd worked out an arrangement with, and she had enough of her own to respect the arrangement. He learned about her in return, though she suspected not as much as she'd inadvertently given away. She mentioned her mother once. She mentioned the bookkeeping work and why she'd learned it. A Methodist woman in the town she'd grown up in had run a small school that Eliza had attended after her father's remarriage made the house less habitable, and this woman had believed that numbers were the most practical thing she could give a girl with no family money, because you could always find work if you could keep accounts. Eliza said this, and then felt she'd said more than she intended, and stopped. Cole was quiet for a moment. She was right, he said. She was. On the second afternoon, while he was outside, Eliza moved carefully around the cabin on the bad leg, partly to test it, and partly because sitting still too long made her restless in a way that felt counterproductive. She looked at the things in the room, not prying, just looking, the way you look at a space that tells you things about the person in it. The cabin was spare, not poor, not deprived, just stripped of things that served no purpose. There were books on a shelf above the window, 3 of them, worn, the kind that had been read multiple times rather than collected. A surveyor's map was pinned to the wall near the door, the east pasture marked in pencil with several additional notes she didn't try to read. The furniture was built rather than bought, every piece solid and without decoration, the work of someone who was good with his hands and had no patience for anything that wasn't functional. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, there was a small framed photograph. A woman, young, fair-haired, formal in the way photographs of that period required people to be formal, stiff-backed and unsmiling for the camera. She was pretty in an unassertive way. Beside her, younger and less weathered, clearly Cole, his expression in the photograph the same watchful guardedness he still carried. Eliza looked at it for a moment and then looked away and went back to her chair. When he came in that evening, she was reading one of the books from the shelf. She'd asked, internally, decided that borrowing a book you could see from your chair was unlikely to constitute a serious offense, and taken it down. He noticed it in her hands and didn't say anything. "Does it bother you?" she said. "Me reading it." "No." "What happened to her?" She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out before the thought fully formed. He sat down across from her and worked his boots off and set them by the door, and she thought he wasn't going to answer, which would have been fair, and she was already composing the apology for asking when he said, "She left. 3 years after we came here. She didn't want this life. Didn't tell me that until she'd already decided, and then she told me and left." He looked at his hands. "I don't think either of us was wrong, exactly. I think we wanted different things, and neither of us said so until the wanting had been doing damage for a long time." Eliza considered that. "Do you still think about her?" "Less than I used to." He looked up. "That sounds worse than it is." "No," she said. "It sounds honest." Something shifted in the room when she said that. Not dramatically. Nothing between them was dramatic, which was something she was beginning to appreciate, but she felt it, a small recalibration, like two people who have been sitting at a careful distance from each other, both moving, without acknowledging it, slightly closer to the center. He asked her that evening, while she was helping him clear the supper things. She'd insisted on helping, and he hadn't argued, why she'd come to Red Hollow specifically, of all the places she could have gone. She told him about Pratt's letter, about the quick response without too many questions, and then she said, "I needed somewhere that didn't know me yet, somewhere I could be a different version of what I'd been." Has it worked? She thought about Margaret Calloway's laugh carrying through the dark from the back of a horse. It's complicated. Most things are. She handed him the last of the dishes and dried her hands on the towel he kept folded over the oven handle and said, Can I ask you something? And you can tell me if it's not your business to answer." He waited. "The dare. Sending me out to your barn. Do you think Margaret knows? Do you think she planned it to get at you specifically, or was she just—" "Both," he said, without hesitating. "She'd have done it to any newcomer she wanted to humble. You were just also useful for what she's been trying to do with my land." He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms, not in a defensive way, but in the way of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and has come to a settled place with it. Her father's been after the East pasture for 4 years. He's tried buying it, tried legal challenges, tried the county. The creek matters more than the land. Whoever controls the creek controls the grazing south of the hills, which is where his main herd runs in summer. He needs it, and he can't get it, and it makes him furious. So Margaret hurting me was partly about hurting you? Or about sending a message that the people who associate with me end up in bad situations? He looked at her steadily. "That's why I'm telling you. When you go back to town, you'll want to think about what your position is." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "People are going to ask where you spent the last 2 days. You can tell them anything you want, but if they find out you were here, there'll be talk, and the talk will be about you, not about what was done to you." He wasn't saying it apologetically. He was saying it the way he said everything, clearly, and without softening it into something easier to hold. "I'm not asking you to lie. I'm just saying you should know what you're walking back into." She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. Then she said, "I've been walked into bad situations by people's talk before. I haven't stopped walking." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, something between the two, more guarded than either. "All right," he said. She slept that night without waking, which was unusual for her. In the morning, the leg was markedly better, stiff, sore, but functional. And after breakfast, he saddled his horse and helped her mount and told her the road south would put her on the main track into town within a mile. She gathered the reins and looked down at him from the saddle. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of November day that promises nothing and delivers nothing but light. "Thank you," she said. "I don't say that carelessly." He nodded. The way he accepted things, the same way he gave them, without ceremony, without making a production of them, was something she found, she realized, unusual and useful. "If you have trouble at Pratt's," he said, "because of where you've been, write it down. Whatever's said to you, whatever they claim, write it down with dates. People like the Calloways run on the difference between what actually happened and what people can be made to believe happened. Documentation cuts that difference down." She looked at him. It was an oddly specific piece of advice for a man reputed to keep entirely to himself. "I learned the hard way," he said, reading her look. "The surveyor I allegedly threatened. I had my deed. I also had a letter he'd written beforehand that said the creek access was negotiable. When the county clerk saw it, the challenge disappeared." He stepped back from the horse. "People assume if you're alone, you're not paying attention. That's usually their mistake." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yours too, maybe," she said, "assuming you're better off alone." His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. That same small recalibration she'd felt the evening before. He didn't answer. She didn't wait for him to. She turned the horse south and started down toward the road. She didn't look back, but she was aware of him standing there until the track curved and the cabin passed out of her line of sight. And she sat with that awareness for a while as the horse found its pace and the town came slowly into the distance ahead of her. She thought about what he'd said, about Margaret, about the creek, about writing things down. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece and the books on the shelf, and the way he'd paused before unwrapping her bandage, patient with her pain, without announcing that patience. She thought about a man who had been told by the accumulated weight of a town's assumptions that he was dangerous, and had responded not by correcting it, but by withdrawing, and had lived with the resulting silence for years until it had become so habitual that he'd probably stopped noticing it the way the people born in Red Hollow had stopped noticing the wind. She understood that particular adaptation more than she wanted to admit. When the track joined the main road, she straightened in the saddle and set her face toward Red Hollow, and thought about what documentation she might have already. She had the dress she'd been wearing. There was blood on it, and torn fabric at the hem from the bandage she'd improvised. She had her memory of the evening, which was detailed and specific and would hold up well under direct questioning. She had the names of 4 women who had been present, and she knew which of them was most likely to crack under the right kind of pressure. She thought about Ruth Sayers, who had said you don't have to, with that particular flatness in her voice, and she thought that Ruth Sayers might be the most important person she spoke to when she got back. The horse moved steadily south. Red Hollow appeared first as a cluster of rooftops in the flat morning light, then as buildings, then as a street. The main street with its storefronts and its church and its two saloons and its patterns of people who had all arrived in this place by one road or another and were all, in one way or another, still trying to make something of it. She rode down the main street on Cole Varden's horse, and she did not hurry, and she did not duck her head, and several people looked at her, and she looked back at them, and nobody said anything, not yet, but she could feel the questions already forming in the air around her like weather. She returned the horse to the livery with a note asking the man there to see it got back to Cole Varden's ranch, which she knew would spread as fast as any other piece of information in a town this size, and she was not certain whether that was good or bad, and decided it was simply the truth, and the truth would do what it was going to do regardless of whether she tried to manage it. She went to her room in the boarding house. She washed her face and changed her dress, and sat down at the small writing desk by the window and took out paper and a pen and wrote down everything she could remember, in order, with times where she could estimate them. What Margaret had said, what Ada had laughed at, what Frances had done, what Ruth had said, and the way she'd said it, the sound of the padlock, the temperature, the wound, what Cole had done, and in what order. She filled 3 pages. She dated them and folded them and put them in the inside pocket of her second coat, the heavier one she didn't wear daily. Then she went downstairs for breakfast, because she was hungry, and because she worked in 2 hours, and her leg was functional, and there was no practical reason to hide in her room, and she walked into the dining room and sat down at the long table and poured herself coffee from the pot at the center, and when Ada Nichols walked in 3 minutes later and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of her, Eliza looked up and said pleasantly, "Good morning," and held Ada's eyes until Ada looked away first. It was a small thing. A very small thing, but it was the first one, and she had found, in her experience, that how you begin a thing has a way of shaping what comes after. Ada Nichols looked away first, and that small surrender carried through the dining room like a current neither of them acknowledged out loud. Margaret was not at breakfast that morning. Neither was Frances. Ruth came down 20 minutes after Eliza had started eating, stopped at the foot of the stairs, and did the same thing Ada had done. That involuntary halt, that moment of recalculation. But Ruth's reaction was different from Ada's. Ada had looked away out of guilt, dressed up as discomfort. Ruth looked at Eliza with something that was closer to relief, which was a more complicated thing to receive, and Eliza wasn't sure yet what to do with it. Ruth sat down at the far end of the table and poured coffee and didn't speak. Eliza didn't force it. She ate her breakfast and thought about the 3 pages folded in the pocket of her heavy coat upstairs, and thought about Pratt's dry goods store, and the 2 hours she had before she needed to be there, and decided that the most useful thing she could do in those 2 hours was nothing dramatic. Just be present. Just be here, eating breakfast, not hiding, not explaining herself to anyone who hadn't asked. She was almost done when Ruth said quietly to her coffee cup, "I'm glad you're not dead." Eliza looked at her. "That's a low bar." "I know." Ruth finally looked up. Her face was tired in the specific way of someone who hadn't slept well for days rather than just the previous night. "I didn't know she was going to chain the door. I want you to know that. I thought it was going to be cold and unpleasant, and you'd come back in the morning angry, and that would be the end of it." "You said I didn't have to." "Yes. But you didn't say why." Ruth looked back down at her cup. "No, I didn't." She turned the cup in her hands, a small restless rotation. Margaret has a way of making things seem inevitable. Like if you don't go along with what she's decided, you're the one making it strange. I've been going along with things that felt wrong for 2 years because the alternative felt worse. She stopped turning the cup. "That's not an excuse." "No," Eliza agreed. "It isn't." A silence settled between them, not comfortable but honest. "Will you tell people?" Ruth asked. "What happened?" Eliza considered that question carefully, because it deserved consideration. "I'll tell the truth when people ask me directly. I won't go out of my way to protect anyone who locked me in a barn in November and rode away." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's fair." "What will you do?" Eliza asked. "If it comes to it. If someone asks you." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Eliza watched her work through it, the internal calculation of what Ruth Sayers wanted her life to look like against what she'd allowed it to become. It was not a fast calculation. But when Ruth looked up, there was something different in her eyes. Not resolution exactly, more like the first edge of it, the place where a decision starts before the person is fully ready to own it. I'll tell the truth, Ruth said, when it comes to it. Eliza nodded and finished her coffee and went upstairs to prepare for work. The walk to Pratt's was 4 blocks. She did it on the bad leg with her coat buttoned to the collar and her eyes forward, and she counted the looks she got from people on the street, 5, in 4 blocks, which in a town this size meant the story was already moving. She didn't know what shape it was taking yet. That was the thing about town talk. It spread faster than you could track it, and by the time you encountered it, it had already been through enough hands to bear almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. Pratt was behind the counter when she came in. He was a compact man in his 50s, gray-whiskered, with the focused efficiency of someone who had run a small business long enough that he'd reduced everything to its essential motions. He looked at her when she came through the door with the look of a man who had already heard something and was working out how to address it. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she agreed. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook behind the counter and pulled out the ledger she'd been working through. "I'm sorry about yesterday. There was a situation. It won't affect the work." Pratt watched her for a moment. "Margaret Calloway came in yesterday afternoon," he said. "Said you'd had some kind of breakdown, that you'd wandered off and spent the night somewhere inappropriate, and that I should be aware of your—" Her word was instability. Eliza's hand stilled on the ledger. She kept her face even. "Did she?" "She did." He leaned on the counter. "I've known Margaret Calloway since she was 9 years old, and I've never once seen her go out of her way to protect someone else's reputation. So I'm inclined to hear your version before I form an opinion." She looked at him steadily. "I was locked in Cole Varden's barn by Margaret and 3 other women from the boarding house as what they called a dare. I was injured. Cole Varden found me before sunrise and carried me to his cabin and treated my leg, and I stayed until I could walk." She paused. "That's the complete version. There's no other version." Pratt's expression didn't shift dramatically. He was a man who had heard a lot of things over a long career and had developed the ability to absorb information without performing a reaction to it. "Cole Varden," he said. "Yes." "He treat you all right?" "Better than anyone else did that night." Pratt straightened up and looked at the ledger, and then at the shelf behind her that needed restocking. "All right," he said. "Get to the receivables. We're 3 days behind." She got to the receivables. She worked through the morning with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything, the numbers clean and the columns straight, and she was aware the whole time of Pratt moving around the store doing his own work. And she was grateful for him in the specific way you're grateful for people who respond to a difficult situation by simply continuing forward. By midday, the story had completed its first full circuit of Red Hollow. She knew this because 2 women came into the store within an hour of each other, both browsing with the distracted quality of people who are primarily there to get a look at something rather than to buy anything, and Eliza served them both with the same courteous efficiency she'd been hired for and didn't give them anything to carry back. Margaret's version, as best Eliza could piece it together from fragments over the next 2 days, went like this. Eliza Harper had gotten it into her head to visit Cole Varden's property, had broken into his barn, trespassing, clearly, and had spent not 1 night but 2 in the company of a man she barely knew, under circumstances that no respectable woman would permit. The dare was not mentioned. The padlock was not mentioned. The blood and the cold and the hours alone were not mentioned. What was mentioned consistently was Eliza's lack of family, her lack of connections, her arrival in Red Hollow from elsewhere, and the suggestion, never stated directly, always hovering just at the edge of the thing being said, that a woman who had grown up without proper guidance might simply not know how to behave properly. It was, Eliza had to admit, a well-constructed piece of work. It took the true facts and rearranged them into a shape that required no outright lies and produced an entirely false picture. She'd heard similar constructions before and knew how durable they were. People didn't need to be told what to think about a woman who spent 2 nights in a man's house. The shape of the story did that work for them. She was at her desk at Pratt's on Thursday afternoon when the bell above the door rang and Margaret Calloway walked in. Eliza did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was writing, set the pen down precisely, and then raised her eyes. Margaret was dressed well, as she always was, and had the composed expression of someone who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go and has not left room for alternative outcomes. "Eliza," she said, pleasant, warm, the tone she used for everything, the tone that had convinced Eliza for 3 foolish weeks that warmth was what it was. "Margaret," equal pleasantness, equal warmth. Eliza had been practicing that register since she was 12. Margaret came to the counter. "I've been worried about you, after everything that happened." She lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the store at the moment. "I want you to know that what happened wasn't how it was supposed to go. It was meant to be a bit of fun. Nobody intended for you to get hurt." Eliza looked at her. "Who put the padlock on the door?" A small beat. "The door was already—" "No," Eliza said. "It wasn't. You showed me it was open when we arrived. Someone locked it after I went inside. Who was it?" Margaret's pleasant expression didn't break, but something underneath it contracted slightly, the way a hand tightens before it moves. "I think you're remembering it wrong. You were frightened. Memory does strange things when—" "I heard it," Eliza said. "The padlock. I know what a lock closing sounds like." "Eliza," on the counter, a gesture that managed to look both friendly and deliberate. "I came here because I'm concerned about the stories you're apparently telling people, about Cole Varden, about what you're claiming happened." She kept her voice very even. "That man is dangerous. My father has been trying for years to protect this town from what he's capable of. And people listening to—" "Your father wants his creek," Eliza said. The pleasant expression held, but it was holding by effort now rather than by ease. Margaret's eyes had gone very still, the stillness of a person deciding how much to let show. "I don't know what Cole Varden told you. I imagine he has quite a story about the land dispute and my family's involvement. I imagine it's very sympathetic." She paused. "He's had a lot of time alone up there to work on it." "He told me about the surveyor and the letter that made the county challenge disappear," Eliza said. "He told me your father has been trying to get the east pasture for 4 years. He told me he has documentation for all of it." She kept her own voice level, the same level she used for the account books, the same level she used for everything that required precision. "And I have documentation of my own. About the night in the barn. 3 pages dated, with times where I could estimate them. What you said. What Ada laughed at. What Ruth said." She held Margaret's gaze. "What Ruth said is going to be interesting to people, I think, when she repeats it herself." Something moved through Margaret's face. Not fear, not yet. Something prior to fear, the first recognition that a situation is not unfolding according to plan. Her hands on the counter were still. She was working through it. Eliza could see her working through it, revising. "Ruth won't," she started. "I think she will," Eliza said simply. "I think she's been going along with things she doesn't agree with for long enough that she's looking for a reason to stop. I may have given her one." Margaret straightened up. The pleasant expression was gone now, replaced with something cooler and more honest, and Eliza found she preferred it. At least it was real. "You're making a serious mistake," Margaret said. "My father is the largest landowner in this county. He sits on the town council. His lawyer has offices in the county seat and has been handling Callaway business for 20 years. You're a bookkeeper with no family and no connections, and you've been in Red Hollow for less than a month." She let that sit for a moment. "And you've associated yourself with a man that this town has very specific feelings about. Whatever you think you have in 3 pages of notes, I promise you it won't be worth what fighting this costs you." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She looked at Margaret Callaway, really looked at her, past the copper-red hair and the careful dressing and the social machinery that had run so smoothly for so long, and saw what she should have seen from the beginning, which was a woman who had never once been made to feel the consequences of what she did to other people, and had therefore never developed any particular reason to stop. "I think you should go," Eliza said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to the door and pushed it open, and the bell above it rang, and she left without looking back. Eliza sat with the silence for a moment. Her hands were steady. She picked up her pen and went back to the receivables. That evening she wrote a letter to Cole Varden. She wasn't sure he would receive it. She didn't know how often he came into town or whether anyone delivered to his road. But she addressed it, care of the livery, where she'd returned his horse, on the assumption that at some point the horse's return would require acknowledgement and he'd be in to settle whatever was owed. The letter was brief. She told him that Margaret Calloway had come to Pratt's that afternoon and that the conversation had been instructive. She told him that Margaret appeared more concerned about Ruth's potential testimony than about Eliza's written account, which suggested Ruth was a credible threat Margaret hadn't fully planned for. She told him about the version of events Margaret had been circulating around town. She told him, because she thought he should know, that he was a central feature of that version, not as someone who had helped her, but as a danger she had been too naive to avoid. At the end she wrote, "You told me people assume that if you're alone, you're not paying attention. I think the same applies to someone new in town. They assume I don't know what I'm looking at yet. I do. I want you to know that." She sealed it and dropped it at the livery on her way back to the boarding house and did not allow herself to think too much about whether or how he would respond. The response came 4 days later, slipped under the door of her room at the boarding house on a Saturday morning, which meant he'd come into town and come to the boarding house specifically, which was not a small thing for a man who came into Red Hollow twice a year and kept to himself when he did. The note was short, written in a plain hand without flourishes. "I appreciate you telling me. Ruth Sayers's father is a decent man. If Ruth is willing to speak, her father may be worth speaking to as well." The lawyer who handled the surveyor letter is named Aldous Creech. He has offices on the county road south of town. He's not connected to Calloway interests. CV. She read it twice and then folded it and added it to the pocket of her heavy coat with the 3 pages of documentation, because she was beginning to understand that this was going to be a thing that required accumulation, of evidence, of allies, of the kind of patient, methodical groundwork that felt slow but held. The following week she approached Ruth. She chose her moment carefully. Not at the boarding house, where walls were thin and Margaret's presence was constant, but at the dry goods store, where Ruth came in on Tuesday mornings for a standing order her mother had maintained for years. Eliza was behind the counter. She waited until Pratt was in the back stockroom and the store was otherwise empty, and Ruth had finished with her order and was gathering herself to leave. "Ruth," she said. Ruth stopped. "I spoke with Margaret last Thursday," Eliza said. "I want you to know what she said about you." Ruth turned slowly. She was holding her basket against her side, and her expression was the expression of someone bracing for something they've been half expecting. Eliza told her. Margaret's implication that Ruth wouldn't speak. The certainty behind it, the way she'd said it, Ruth won't, with the confidence of someone who had tested Ruth's compliance over years and found it reliable. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Eliza finished, Ruth stood quietly for a moment. Outside, the main street noise continued its ordinary pattern. A cart went past. Someone called to someone else 3 doors down. "She told Francis afterward," Ruth said, "that it was your own fault, that any woman foolish enough to fall for that sort of thing deserved what she got." She looked at the basket in her hands. "Francis thought that was very funny." Eliza held her tongue. She had learned early that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in a conversation was not fill the available space. "My father," Ruth said, "doesn't know what I've been involved in, with Margaret's group. He wouldn't." She looked up. "He's particular about honesty. Always has been. It's been an inconvenient quality to grow up around. A flat, almost humor in that, the kind that isn't really about anything being funny. If I told him what happened that night, he'd go to the town council himself. He sits on it. Different seat than Calloway's man. Different interests." "I know," Eliza said. "I was hoping you'd tell me that yourself." Ruth looked at her. A long, assessing look. The look of someone recalibrating who they're dealing with. "You're not what Margaret said you were," Ruth said finally. "No," Eliza agreed. "I'm not." Ruth nodded once, a small decisive motion, and picked up her basket and went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "My father's home most evenings," she said without turning around. "He's usually in his study after supper. He prefers when people come directly and say what they mean." She left. Eliza went back to the account books and tried not to let herself feel too much about it, because the thing wasn't done yet, and feeling too much before a thing was done was a reliable way to lose your footing. The next complication arrived, as complications in small towns tend to, through a channel she hadn't anticipated. It was the boarding house owner, a woman named Dora Pell, who had run the Whitmore establishment for 12 years with the combination of financial pragmatism and social conservatism that the enterprise required. Eliza had not thought much about Dora Pell. She paid her rent on time and gave her no trouble, and had assumed that was sufficient. She understood now that she had been making the same mistake about Dora Pell that she'd made about Margaret Calloway, mistaking neutrality for goodwill. Dora came to her room on a Wednesday evening. She knocked and came in and sat down in the chair by the window without being invited, which told Eliza the tone of what was coming before a word was spoken. "I've had some concerns raised," Dora said, "about your continued presence here." Eliza was sitting on the bed with her stockings off, resting her leg, which still ached in the evenings, and she did not scramble to rearrange herself. "By whom?" "By several residents." Dora folded her hands. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a long, careful face and the air of someone who had made every decision in her life by imagining how it would appear to the most judgmental person she knew. "I run a respectable establishment, Eliza. The women who board here are of good character and good standing. What's being said about the time you spent at Cole Varden's property?" "I was locked in his barn by your other tenants," Eliza said. "I was injured. He helped me. That is the entirety of what happened." Dora's expression flickered. Something in it told Eliza that Dora had already known this, or had known enough of it to know the story she'd been given wasn't complete, and had chosen to proceed with the less complicated version anyway, because the less complicated version was more convenient for the particular social ecosystem she maintained. "Regardless," Dora said, "of the specifics are all that matter," Eliza said. "I was the victim of something deliberately done to me. The people who did it live in your house, and you're in my room telling me that my presence is the problem." Dora's composure held, but with visible effort. "I'm telling you that perception. I have 3 pages of documentation of what happened that night," Eliza said. "I have a witness who was present and has agreed to give an accurate account. I have the dress I was wearing with blood on it from the wound I sustained. And I am about to have a conversation with a member of the town council whose daughter was also present and is prepared to confirm the account." She let that land fully before continuing. "I want you to think carefully about what the perception problem actually is and who has it." The room was quiet. Outside, the boarding house went about its evening. Footsteps in the hall, voices somewhere below, the ordinary sounds of people who had not yet been required to take a position. Dora Pell sat with her hands folded and looked at Eliza Harper with the expression of someone who had walked into a room expecting to manage a small, inconvenient problem, and found instead that the problem was larger and less manageable than advertised. "I see," Dora said at last. "I hope so," Eliza said. "I pay my rent on time, I keep my room, I give you no trouble. I'd like to continue doing all 3, but I won't be managed into leaving to make someone else's position more comfortable." Dora stood. She smoothed her skirt, the habitual gesture of a woman recollecting her composure. "I'll need to think," she said, which was more honest than Eliza had expected from her, and she was given credit for it internally. After Dora left, Eliza sat in the quiet for a while. The lamp on the bedside table cast a steady yellow circle, and she sat inside it and took stock, which was a thing she did when situations complicated themselves to the point where inventory was necessary. She had Ruth tentatively. She had Pratt solidly. She had 3 pages of documentation, a bloodied dress, and the name of a lawyer who wasn't in the Calloway's pocket. She had Cole's note, which she'd added to the growing file of things in her coat pocket. And she had the awareness, clarifying, galvanizing, that this was not a situation that was going to resolve itself through patience and good behavior. It was going to require active work, the kind she was capable of and had simply not yet committed to fully because she'd been trying to remain small and manageable and not cause trouble, and causing no trouble had gotten her locked in a barn. She was done trying to be manageable. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write another letter, this one to Aldous Creech, whose name Cole had given her, on the county road south of town. She introduced herself briefly. She outlined the situation, the incident, the injury, the property, the Calloway land dispute, and its relationship to what had been done to her. And she asked, plainly, whether he would be willing to meet. She was not certain of the outcome. She was not certain of any of it, but she had learned, from a man who kept documentation and watched the creek and had been fighting a quiet war of evidence for 4 years, that the most important thing was to begin. She sealed the letter and set it with the others going out in the morning and turned down the lamp and lay in the dark with the ache in her leg and thought about Cole Varden alone in his cabin 4 miles north, with his maps and his careful records and his photograph on the mantelpiece. The man everyone in this town had decided they understood without ever once talking to him. She thought about what it cost a person to be seen clearly and how rare it was, and how much she had underestimated the value of it before 2 nights in a cabin with someone who did it without effort or performance. She fell asleep before she finished the thought, and when she woke in the morning, the letter was ready, and the day was waiting, and she got up and went to meet it. Aldous Creech wrote back in 5 days. His letter was brief and direct in a way that reminded her of Cole's notes, the correspondence of a man who had spent enough years in legal work to understand that unnecessary words created unnecessary problems. He would meet with her the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. He knew the Calloway name and the land dispute she referenced and had, he wrote, some familiarity with the relevant property history. He made no promises about outcomes. He asked her to bring whatever documentation she had. She read the letter twice at the counter at Pratt's, refolded it, and put it with the other papers in her coat. Pratt, who had observed this exchange with the quiet attention he gave everything, said nothing and went back to his inventory. She went back to the accounts. This was the rhythm they had established, and it served them both. He did not ask her for more than the work, and she did not ask him for more than the employment, and within that clean arrangement, they had built something that functioned. She wrote to Cole that evening. She told him about Creech's response in the Thursday meeting. She told him that Ruth's father, a man named Gerald Sayers, had agreed to meet with her the previous Sunday after Ruth had spoken to him, and that the meeting had gone better than she dared plan for. Gerald Sayers was a compact, deliberate man in his early 60s who had listened to her account with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes on her face and had not interrupted once. When she finished, he had asked 3 questions, each precise, each aimed at a specific detail. And then he had sat quietly for a moment and said, I've had concerns about my daughter's associations for some time. I'm sorry it required this to bring it to a head. She told Cole all of this. At the end she wrote, I think things are moving. I'm not sure how fast or in what direction, but they are moving. I wanted you to know because some of what moves may move toward you. She dropped the letter at the livery as she had the first time, and 3 days later found his response under her door. Gerald Sayers served on the Water Rights Committee in 1887. He voted against Calloway's first attempt to claim the creek access by adverse possession. I didn't know his daughter was involved in this. Thank you for telling me. Go carefully with Creech. He's honest but cautious. Bring everything you have and let him set the pace. Don't push for conclusions before he's ready to draw them. CV. She added it to the coat pocket, which was becoming a kind of archive, and on Thursday afternoon she walked south along the county road to a small 2-room office that sat behind a larger building and had a hand-painted sign above the door that simply read, Creech. Law. Aldous Creech was not what she'd expected, though she'd been trying not to expect anything specific. He was perhaps 60, heavy-set without being soft, with the kind of face that had listened to a great many people over a great many years and had learned to give very little away while doing it. He shook her hand when she came in, not the half-hearted kind some men offered to women, but a real handshake, brief and firm, and gestured her to the chair across from his desk, and sat down and looked at her and said, Tell me everything. Don't organize it yet. Just tell me. So she did. She told him the way she'd told Gerald Sayers, directly, without softening the parts that made her look naive, and without dramatizing the parts that were already dramatic enough on their own. The boarding house, and Margaret Calloway, and the dare that wasn't a dare, the barn and the padlock and the cold, Cole finding her and the 2 nights at the cabin and the leg, coming back to town and the documentation she'd started immediately, Margaret at Pratt's counter and what she'd said and the precise tone she'd used, Dora Pell and the conversation in her room, Ruth and Gerald Sayers. Creech listened through all of it without taking notes, which surprised her, but his eyes were sharp, and she had the impression that he was filing things with a precision that didn't require a pen. When she finished, he sat for a moment. You said Cole Varden found you. Yes. You spent 2 nights at his cabin. Yes. And in your account of those 2 nights, what occurred was medical treatment, meals, and conversation about the Calloway land situation. That's correct. Creech nodded slowly. I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd like you to answer the same way. All right. Is there anything about those 2 nights that you would be uncomfortable having examined in detail by a hostile questioner? She understood what he was asking and why he was asking it, and she answered without hesitation. No. He nodded again. Good. He picked up a pen and pulled a pad of paper toward him. Now, let's go through it in order. They went through it for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked questions she hadn't anticipated, went back to details she'd thought were peripheral, and twice asked her to describe something physical: the padlock, the position of the wound, the layout of Cole's cabin, with the specificity of someone building a structure that would need to hold weight. By the end, she understood that he was not simply taking her account. He was testing it for the places where a hostile version of events could get purchase, and finding those places and shoring them up. The dress, he said. You have it. Yes. I haven't laundered it. Good. Keep it that way. He set down the pen. Now tell me about the land situation. What do you know about it, and how do you know it? She told him what Cole had told her: the east pasture, the creek, the 4 years of Calloway, attempts to acquire the water access, the surveyor, and the letter. She told him Cole had documentation. I know about the surveyor incident, Creech said. I know about it because I was the one who advised Cole Varden to hold the letter rather than discard it. He said it matter-of-factly, as though this was simply an administrative detail. Cole came to me 4 years ago when Calloway first made his move on the pasture. I've been his attorney since. She looked at him. He didn't tell me that. He wouldn't. He's careful about what he says and to whom. Creech folded his hands. He did, however, write to me last week about you. He told me you were someone I should meet with and that I should give your account full weight. In 11 years of knowing Cole Varden, he has said that about exactly no one. He paused. I thought you should know that. She sat with that for a moment. The office was quiet. Through the small window she could see the county road, a wagon going past, the ordinary movement of a Thursday afternoon. What can be done? She said. Creech was quiet for a moment, the considered quiet of a man sorting what was possible from what was wished for. What was done to you? Locking you in that barn. That's criminal trespass at minimum, unlawful confinement under territorial statute, and given the injury, potentially more. The challenge is that Margaret Calloway's name is Margaret Calloway, and the practical question in a case like this is always whether a jury in this county would weigh the law against the name. He picked up his pen again and tapped it once against the pad. Ruth Sayers changes the calculation. Her father changes it further. If Gerald Sayers is willing to stand up publicly, he said he was. Creech looked at her over his reading glasses. People say they're willing when they're sitting comfortably in their own study. It gets more complicated when there's a Calloway lawyer on the other side of a room, making things unpleasant. I know, she said, but I believe him. Creech studied her for a moment. You trust your own read of people. I've had to. All right. He set the pen down. Here's what I want. I want your written account, the 3 pages, and I want the dress. I want you to write a detailed description of the wound, when it occurred and how it was treated, and I want Cole to come in and do the same from his side. I want Ruth Sayers to write a formal statement. I want Gerald Sayers to agree to appear before the council, if it comes to that. He looked at her. And I want you to go about your life normally and give nothing to anyone who's fishing for information. If Margaret Calloway or anyone connected to her approaches you again, you tell them your attorney is handling it. She almost said she hadn't formally retained him. She stopped herself. What are your terms? He waved a hand. Cole Varden's been paying me a retainer for 4 years. This falls within the scope of what I'm already engaged for. If it grows beyond that, we'll discuss it. He stood and offered his hand again. Go home and let me work. She went home. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was not something she trusted. It came too easily and left too fast and had a way of producing carelessness exactly when carelessness was most costly. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, the sense of a thing properly in motion. Cole came into town 3 days later. She knew because he sent a note ahead, slipped under her door again, which meant he'd come in the evening, saying he would be at Creech's office the following morning and asking if she could meet him there at 9. She was there at 9. So was he, standing outside the office door when she came down the county road, hat in hand in the early morning cold. He looked different in town than he had in his own space. Not uncomfortable exactly, but slightly compressed, the way a person looks when they've learned to make themselves smaller in environments that have historically been unwelcoming. He watched her come down the road, and the wariness in his face eased by 1 degree, which for him was the equivalent of visible relief. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She stopped beside him. "How long have you been standing here?" "A while." "You could have gone in." "Creech's door isn't mine to go into without being asked." He said it simply, a statement of principle rather than complaint, and she thought about all the ways a man like Cole Varden had learned to manage his presence in a world that had decided he was a threat before he opened his mouth. Creech arrived 8 minutes later, unlocked the office, and waved them both in without ceremony. The three of them sat around the desk, and Creech walked Cole through the same process he'd walked Eliza through. Direct questions, specific details, no organizing. Cole answered the way he did everything, without elaboration, without deflection, plainly and in full. Creech asked about the creek and the east pasture, and Cole produced, from inside his coat, a folded document that turned out to be 3 documents. His original deed, the surveyor's letter he'd mentioned to Eliza, and a county map with annotations in pencil. He laid them on Creech's desk with the practiced movement of someone who had been keeping these things ready for exactly this kind of moment. Creech studied them without speaking. The office was quiet. Outside, the county road was beginning its morning noise. Horses, wheels, voices, the town waking into its ordinary business. "The county map," Creech said. "Where did you get the annotations?" "I made them," Cole said. "When Calloway's man first came out with the surveyor, I walked the fence line that night and marked every stake they'd placed. Here," he pointed to several penciled marks. "These are where they were trying to establish the eastern boundary. This is not the boundary on my deed. The difference is about 40 feet, but 40 feet here," he tapped the creek line, "is the difference between the water being mine and being his." Creech made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He sat back. He looked at the documents, and then at Cole, and then at Eliza. "You two have been conducting a fairly sophisticated legal defense for people who aren't lawyers." "We've had cause," Cole said. "Yes." Creech looked back at the documents. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the county sheriff regarding the incident with Miss Harper. I'm going to do it this week before Calloway has time to establish his version any further officially. I'm also going to file a response to the adverse possession claim on the east pasture. It's been pending for 8 months, and I've been waiting for the right moment to make it inconvenient for them. This is the right moment." He looked at Cole. "When they realize these 2 things are happening at the same time, they're going to push back, hard. You should be prepared for that." "I've been prepared for it for 4 years, Cole said. Creech almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it was close. "There's also the matter," he said, slightly more carefully, "of Miss Harper's position in town. The complaint will focus attention on her. Some of that attention will not be friendly. Calloway's response is likely to make the personal dimensions of her story a central feature of their counter-narrative." He looked at Eliza. "You understand what I mean?" "They'll go harder at my character," she said, "because it's easier to make people doubt me than to explain the padlock." "Correct." He looked between them. "Is there anything in the relationship between the 2 of you that they could use? Any dimension of it that goes beyond what you've described to me?" Cole and Eliza looked at each other. It was a brief look, but it was not a simple one. Not because there was anything to hide, but because the honest answer required both of them to take account of something they had not yet fully articulated to themselves, which was that 2 months of letters and 2 nights in a warm cabin and the particular ease of each other's silences constituted something, even if neither of them had named it yet. "No," Eliza said. "No," Cole said, at the same moment, and neither of them looked at the other again immediately. Creech nodded. "Then we proceed." The sheriff's name was Hal Drummond, and he was a man of 60 who had held his office for 14 years and was, as Eliza came to understand over the weeks that followed, deeply aware of the political topography of Red Hollow and deeply reluctant to disturb it. He received Creech's formal complaint with the expression of a man being handed something hot that he needed to hold without being seen to drop. He told Creech he would look into it. He told Creech that these were serious accusations involving well-regarded members of the community and that he intended to be thorough. He said the word thorough with the weight of a man who was using it to mean slow. Margaret's response came 8 days after the complaint was filed, and it came in a form Eliza hadn't anticipated. A legal document, served to her at Pratt's store by a man she'd never seen before, who came in on a Tuesday morning and asked for her by name, and handed her a folded paper and left without speaking. She opened it at the counter with Pratt watching and read through it twice. It was a civil claim. Trespass and property damage, filed on behalf of James Calloway, Margaret's father, naming Eliza Harper as the defendant. The substance of it was that Eliza had willfully trespassed on Calloway-adjacent property, had caused damage during her unauthorized presence, and had subsequently made defamatory statements about the Calloway family that had damaged their standing in the community. Attached to it was a supporting affidavit from Margaret Calloway, Ada Nichols, and Frances Pryor, all three of whose accounts agreed with each other perfectly. Too perfectly. With identical phrasing in places that suggested they had been composed by the same person rather than written independently. Eliza read the affidavits with care. She noticed the identical phrases. She folded the document and took it to Creech that afternoon. Creech read it and set it down and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she started to worry. Then he said, "They've made a mistake." She waited. "These affidavits." He tapped the pages. "Look at this phrase here. Of her own free volition and without invitation or instigation. Same in all three. And here, no coercion was present or implied. Word for word." He looked up. If these were genuinely independent accounts, they wouldn't be this identical. Nobody remembers things in exactly the same words. This tells me these affidavits were drafted centrally and signed, not written individually. He sat back. That's suborning false testimony. That's more serious than anything they filed against you. She thought about Margaret at Pratt's counter. "I promise you it won't be worth what fighting this costs you." She thought about how long Margaret had been doing this, how many times the social machinery had turned exactly the way she'd planned it to, and the person on the receiving end had simply left or gone quiet, or been ground down enough that they stopped pushing back. "What do we do?" she said. "Ruth Sayers writes her statement today," Creech said. "Not tomorrow. Today." He stood. "And I'm going to pay a visit to Sheriff Drummond that he is not going to enjoy." She went directly from Creech's office to the boarding house. Ruth was in her room. Eliza knocked, and Ruth opened the door and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "Happened," Eliza told her. She showed her the identical phrases in the affidavits. She watched Ruth read them, watched the expressions move through Ruth's face, recognition first, then something harder, the anger of someone who has let herself be complicit in things, because the alternative seemed too difficult, and has now encountered the specific consequence of that complicity in printed form. "She used my name," Ruth said. It was a quiet statement, almost surprised. "No," Eliza said. "She used Ada and Frances. Your name is not on this." Ruth looked up. "She didn't include you," Eliza said, "because she wasn't sure which way you'd fall. She left you out to give herself options." Ruth sat down on the edge of her bed and held the papers. She read them again. She looked up at Eliza, and her face had the particular set of someone who has been weighing something for a long time and has finally found the thing that tips the scale. "Tell me where to go," Ruth said. "I'll write the statement today." Ruth Sayers wrote 4 pages. Her statement was the most damaging single document in the file Creech was assembling, because unlike Eliza's account, which Calloway's lawyer could attribute to grievance and exaggeration, Ruth's account came from inside. She had been there. She had watched Margaret produce the padlock, not find it, produce it, from the bag she'd brought on the ride out. And she had heard the instructions Margaret gave Ada about how fast to ride away and how long to wait before coming back in the morning. She had said you don't have to, and known it wasn't enough and done nothing more. And she wrote about that too, without softening it, because she was Gerald Sayers's daughter, and she had been raised to believe that half-honesty was a form of lying. She signed it and dated it, and Eliza took it to Creech that afternoon. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of any in Eliza's time in Red Hollow, and they were difficult in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, because the difficulty wasn't dramatic. It was the slow grind of a town realigning around a conflict it would rather have ignored. People who had been neutral became cautious. People who had been casually friendly became less so. She was not shunned, nothing so clear as that, but she felt the social temperature drop by several degrees and stay there, and she went to work every day and did the accounts and walked the 4 blocks back to the boarding house and sat in her room in the evenings and was honest with herself about what it cost. Cole's name was in more conversations now. She heard it in the street, in the store, passing references that told her the Calloway civil claim had reactivated the old stories and given them new purpose. A man who'd been keeping to himself for 9 years was suddenly relevant again, and the relevance was not flattering, and none of it touched the reality of who he actually was, which was something she found she had increasingly strong feelings about. She wrote to him more often than was strictly necessary for the legal situation. He wrote back. The letters remained functional on their surface. Updates about Creech, about Ruth's statement, about the sheriff's investigation, which Drummond was conducting with the thoroughness he'd promised, which meant very slowly. But the letters had also begun to contain other things, observations, small things noticed in passing, offered and received without comment on the offering. She told him she'd seen a red-tailed hawk sitting on the post at the end of Pratt's loading dock for 20 minutes on a cold morning, not hunting, just sitting, as though it had decided the post was its own for a while. He wrote back that he'd had the same hawk, or one very like it, working the fence line of his west pasture for the past month, and that it had a distinctive tilt to its left wing when it banked that made it recognizable. He wrote that he'd started to look for it in the mornings without meaning to. She read that letter in her room and sat with it for a while, and was careful with herself about what she allowed herself to feel. The thing Creech had predicted, that Calloway would push back hard, arrived in early December in the form of a formal legal order, delivered again to Pratt's store by the same man in the same impersonal way. This one was different. It was addressed not just to Eliza, but referenced Cole Varden by name, and was signed by a county judge whose name appeared on the letterhead above the name of the circuit court. It ordered Eliza Harper to cease and desist all activities connected to the pending complaint, required her to appear at a county hearing in the 3rd week of December, and stated, in the particular language of legal instruments that say devastating things in flat, even terms, that her continued residence at the Whitmore boarding house was under formal challenge on grounds of the disruption her presence had created to the peace and order of the establishment. Below that, almost as an addendum, was a separate order requiring Cole Varden to appear at the same hearing regarding the East Pasture land dispute, which had been reactivated and was now in formal proceedings. She read it twice. She sat down on the stool behind Pratt's counter and read it a 3rd time. Pratt came out from the back and looked at her face and then at the paper. She handed it to him without speaking. He read it and set it down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll want to get this to Creech today." "Yes," she said. "The part about the boarding house," he said carefully. "Do you have somewhere to stay, if it comes to it?" She hadn't thought that far yet. She made herself think it now. She had very little money beyond what was coming in from the position. The boarding house was the only establishment in Red Hollow that rented to single women. There was nothing else in town, and she was not going to leave town. She looked at the paper in Pratt's hands and felt something settle in her. Not calm exactly, more like the cold clarity that comes when the situation strips itself down to its essential question, and the essential question demands an answer, and the answer, when you look at it honestly, is already there. "I'll figure it out," she said. She took the papers to Creech. He read them standing up, which told her something, and when he looked up his face was serious in a way she hadn't seen before. "They got to Judge Mercer," he said. "Is he Calloway's?" "Not directly, but Calloway's lawyer has been in front of Mercer's court for 15 years, and Mercer runs for re-election in the spring, and Calloway money funds half the county party." He set the papers down. "This is them escalating. They know we have Ruth's statement. They know Gerald Sayers is behind it. They're trying to get ahead of it, make it a formal legal proceeding on their terms before it becomes a formal legal proceeding on ours." "Can they remove me from the boarding house?" "They can try. Whether they can succeed depends on whether Dora Pell will fight it, and I wouldn't bet on Dora Pell fighting anything." He looked at her steadily. "Where would you go?" She thought about it. She thought about the options, which were limited, and she thought about what she'd said to Pratt. "I'll figure it out." And she thought about the coat pocket with its growing archive of documents and letters. And she thought about a man 4 miles north who had been paying a retainer to a lawyer for 4 years, and making pencil annotations on county maps, and keeping letters from surveyors in case they were ever needed, who had looked at her across a fireplace 2 months ago and said, "Go carefully as though it mattered to him what happened to her." "I'll write to Cole," she said. Creech looked at her. A long look. the careful look of a man deciding whether to say something. He chose to say it. You understand that if you stay at his property, the Calloway version of events gets considerably simpler to argue. I know. And you're considering it anyway. I'm considering it because the alternative is leaving town and losing everything we've built these past 2 months, she said. And I'm not leaving. She held his gaze. Cole Varden opened a locked barn door in the middle of the night and carried me out of it when he had every reason to leave well enough alone. I think I understand his character better than this town does. Creech was quiet. Then he said, All right, write to him. But let me write to him as well. About the hearing, about what we need from him for it. We're 2 weeks out, and there's work to do. She wrote the letter that evening. She told Cole about the order, about the boarding house situation, about Creech's assessment of Judge Mercer. She told him the hearing was in 2 weeks, and that Creech believed they had a strong case if they could get in front of it properly. Then she wrote the part she'd been deciding how to write for the length of the letter. I may need somewhere to stay. I want to be straightforward with you about what that might cost you in terms of how people here talk. And I want you to know that I will not hold you to anything simply because you've already helped me. You don't owe me this, and I am not asking out of anything but necessity. If the answer is no, I'll find another way. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you've done over these past months, the letters, the documentation, all of it, has mattered more than I know how to say properly. She sealed it and delivered it and lay awake for a while in the boarding house room that might or might not remain hers, listening to the wind off the northern hills do its patient work against the window glass. And she thought about 2 weeks and a county hearing and a judge who ran for re-election on Calloway money. And she thought about everything she had gathered over these months and what it weighed against what was arrayed against it. And she thought it was close. She thought it was very close. Cole's letter came 2 days later, slipped under her door in the early morning. It was the shortest letter he'd sent her. 3 sentences. Come when you need to. The bedroom is yours. I'll be at Creech's office Thursday at 8. She read it standing in the doorway in the early light, and then folded it and put it with the others, and went to the window and looked out at Red Hollow, waking into its morning, and thought that whatever happened in that hearing room in 2 weeks, she was not going to be standing in it alone. And that was not something she had been able to say about any room she'd walked into in a very long time. She moved her things to Cole's cabin on a Sunday. She did not do it quietly or by night, which would have been the easier choice and the one that gave the least material to the people already talking. She hired the liveryman's cart, loaded her trunk and her 2 bags in the morning light on the main street of Red Hollow, and drove herself north on the county road in plain view of anyone who happened to be out, which on a Sunday morning was enough people to ensure that by afternoon everyone in town would know. She had thought about this decision and made it deliberately. There was nothing shameful in what she was doing, and she was not going to behave as though there was. The drive north took 40 minutes. The hills were gray-brown in the December light. The creek she could see from the road running low and clear between its frozen edges. She pulled the cart up to Cole's porch, and he came out before she'd set the brake. He'd heard the wheels on the frozen ground, and stood on the top step and looked at her and the loaded cart and said nothing for a moment. I brought my own blankets, she said. Something in his face moved, not quite a smile. The thing that happened in his face instead of a smile, which she had learned to read over 2 months of letters and one Thursday morning in Creech's office. I've got enough blankets, he said. I know. She set the brake. I brought them anyway. He came down and helped her unload without making a production of it, and within an hour her trunk was in the bedroom, and her bags were unpacked, and her 2 extra dresses were hanging on the hooks behind the door, and she stood in the main room of Cole Varden's cabin and looked around at the space she'd last been in 2 months ago. The books on the shelf, the map on the wall, the mantelpiece with the photograph, and felt the particular strangeness of a place that is both familiar and newly real. Cole put coffee on. She sat at the table. The ordinary domesticity of it was somehow the strangest part. The hearing is in 12 days, she said. I know. Creech thinks we're ready. He told me. Cole brought 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat across from her. Do you think we're ready? She considered it honestly. I think we have more truth on our side than they do. Whether that's the same thing as being ready depends on Judge Mercer. Cole wrapped both hands around his cup. Outside the wind was doing its work on the eaves. Mercer's not a bad man, he said, which surprised her. He's a careful man. He doesn't like being wrong publicly. If we can make the right answer the one that's also the safe answer for him, he'll take it. And if we can't, he looked at her over the rim of his cup. Then we appeal. And we keep appealing. He said it simply, without bravado. Just the statement of someone who had been in a long fight long enough to understand that the only real strategy was not to stop. They're counting on us deciding it's not worth it. That's always what they're counting on. She drank her coffee and thought about that. She thought about all the times in her life she had decided something wasn't worth it, not because she believed it, but because the cost of continuing had simply exceeded what she could sustain alone. She thought about what it felt like to not be alone in the sustaining of it, and how new that feeling still was, and how carefully she was trying not to need it too much before she was sure of it. "There's something I want to ask you," she said. He waited. "The photograph?" "On the mantelpiece." She didn't look at it. She looked at him. "When I was here in October, I looked at it. I shouldn't have brought it up then, and I didn't. But I'm living here now, and I think—" She stopped, started differently. "I'm not asking about her. I'm asking if having it there is something you want, because I've been in rooms that kept the wrong things on the walls for the wrong reasons, and it doesn't serve anybody." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Cole looked at the mantelpiece. He looked at it for long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated, overstepped, said the thing that broke the particular careful balance they'd maintained. Then he got up and walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the photograph and stood looking at it for a moment. She watched him. His back was to her, and she couldn't see his face, and she waited. He opened the drawer in the small table beside the mantelpiece and put the photograph inside and closed the drawer. He stood there for another second with his hand on the drawer handle, and then he turned around and came back to the table and sat down and picked up his coffee. "It wasn't about her," he said. "It was about a version of my life that didn't work out. I kept it there because I thought I should remember that." He looked at his cup. "I don't think I need reminding anymore." She didn't say anything. She had learned from him, over the months of their correspondence, that some things were received better in silence than in response, and this was one of them. They sat with their coffee and the fire and the wind outside, and neither of them said what was in the room alongside them, but it was there, and they both knew it, and for now, that was enough. The 12 days before the hearing were not peaceful days. Creech was in motion constantly, filing responses to the civil claim, gathering supporting documentation, corresponding with the county recorder's office about the original deed and boundary survey on Cole's east pasture. He met with Gerald Sayers twice, and with Ruth once more. And he wrote Eliza a careful letter laying out the structure of what the hearing would look like, who would speak, and in what order, and where he expected resistance. He expected it from Calloway's lawyer, a man named Terrence Galt, who had been doing Calloway business for 22 years and was, Creech wrote with the restraint of a man describing a competitor, skilled at making complicated situations feel simple, and simple situations feel impossible. He expected it from Judge Mercer's general reluctance to rule against established interests. He expected it, in a quieter way, from the accumulated weight of 9 years of Red Hollow's settled opinion about Cole Varden, which would be in the room whether anyone acknowledged it or not. What he did not expect, and what arrived 4 days before the hearing like weather that changes the whole day, was Ada Nichols. Ada came to Creech's office alone, without Margaret's knowledge. Creech told Eliza this afterward with the careful neutrality of a man reporting a fact whose implications he didn't want to oversell. She had read the civil complaint and the affidavit that bore her name and the identical phrases in it, and she had, in Creech's words, developed concerns. She was engaged to be married. Her fiancé's family was not connected to the Calloways, but was connected to the Sayers, distantly, through a cousin's marriage, and Gerald Sayers had apparently said something at a dinner party the previous week that had reached Ada's fiancé's ears, and then Ada's ears, and had made the identical phrases in the affidavit feel considerably more dangerous than they had when Margaret had handed her the pen. Ada gave Creech a statement. It was not as complete as Ruth's. Ada was protecting herself as much as she was telling the truth, and Creech understood the difference and took what was usable. What was usable was significant. Confirmation that the padlock had been brought by Margaret, that the ride-away had been planned rather than spontaneous, and that the affidavit she'd signed had been drafted by Galt's office and given to her to sign rather than written in her own words. That last point, Creech told Eliza when he briefed her the evening before the hearing, was the one that mattered most. Galt drafted a false affidavit and had witnesses sign it, Creech said. They were sitting in his office, the three of them, Creech, Eliza, Cole, in the lamplight of a late afternoon that had gone dark early the way December afternoons did. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal conduct by an officer of the court. Mercer knows it, and Mercer knows I know it, and that changes the hearing tomorrow considerably. Cole was quiet. He'd been quiet for most of the briefing, which was his way of paying full attention. How does it change it? Mercer needs this to resolve cleanly, Creech said. He doesn't want a complaint to the Bar Association. He doesn't want the circuit court looking at how his court handled a case where the opposing counsel suborned false testimony. The cleanest resolution for him is to find for us on the main points and let Galt deal with his own problems separately. He looked at both of them. It's not guaranteed. Mercer still has to balance the Calloway name against everything else. But his personal interests and our legal position are now pointing in the same direction, and that's better than where we were a week ago. Eliza looked at Cole. He was looking at the map on Creech's wall. The county map, different from his own, this one official and printed, the property lines sharp and clean. His jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was working through something without showing the work. What about the East Pasture? He said. The East Pasture is stronger than the criminal matter, Creech said. Your deed is clear. The survey they filed in opposition relies on the same surveyor whose letter we have. Galt knows it. That's why they've been sitting on the adverse possession claim for 8 months without pushing it to hearing. They were hoping you'd sell or move rather than fight. He paused. Tomorrow, we demonstrate that you're not going to do either. Cole nodded once. He looked at Eliza. Are you ready? She thought about 12 days ago, standing on the main street of Red Hollow with her trunk in a cart and the whole town watching. She thought about 3 pages of documentation written the morning after she came back from a locked barn because a man who'd been fighting his own quiet war for 4 years had told her to write things down. She thought about Ruth Sayers's 4 pages and Gerald Sayers at a dinner party saying something that had rattled its way to Ada Nichols, and Aldous Creech filing responses and gathering records and building a structure that would hold weight. Yes, she said. The hearing was held in the county courthouse on the 3rd floor, in a room that smelled of old paper and wood oil and the accumulated proceedings of many years. It was not a large room. The gallery, a pair of long benches against the back wall, was full by the time Eliza and Cole arrived with Creech, and she recognized faces from Red Hollow, more of them than she'd expected, which told her the hearing had been discussed and anticipated in ways she hadn't fully tracked. She saw Margaret Calloway in the front row of the gallery, beside a man she hadn't met but who had the bearing and the careful dress of James Calloway, Margaret's father, the man who wanted the creek. He was heavier than she'd imagined, gray-haired, with the face of someone accustomed to being correct by default. He looked at Cole when Cole came in with the assessing look of a man who had been trying for years to remove something from his landscape and could not understand why it was still there. Terence Galt was already at the opposing table, a tall man, angular, with the precise movements of someone who used his physical presence deliberately in court. He looked at Creech when Creech came in and gave him a nod that was professional and told nothing. Eliza sat beside Cole at the table on their side. Under the table, her hands were folded in her lap, still. She could feel the weight of the coat she'd hung over her chair, the coat with the pocket that held the archive of everything, every letter and note and folded document accumulated over 2 months of slow, deliberate building. She didn't need to take it out. Creech had the copies. Everything was where it needed to be. She had done what she could do, and now the room would do what it would do, and she would stay present for it regardless of what that was. Judge Mercer came in, and the room stood and sat, the old courtroom rhythm of it. He was a spare man in his 60s with reading glasses on a cord, and the face of someone who had seen enough proceedings to have stopped being surprised by most of them. He looked at the papers before him and looked at both tables and said they would proceed with the civil complaint filed on behalf of James Calloway first, and then address the property matter, and he expected both sides to be concise. Galt opened. He was good. Creech had said he was good, and he was, with the particular skill of a man who could make a questionable position sound like common sense by speaking about it in the tone of a man describing something obvious. He laid out the Calloway complaint with the facts organized to tell a specific story. An unstable young woman, new to town and unknown, had trespassed on property adjacent to the Calloway grazing lands, had subsequently made damaging accusations against respected community members, and had taken up residence with a man whose own standing in the community was, he said, with a careful pause, well documented. Then Creech rose. Eliza had not seen Creech in court before. She had seen him in his office, precise, methodical, building structures. In court he was different, not louder, not more dramatic, but somehow more present, as though the room activated something in him that the office kept at a lower register. He spoke without notes. He laid out the timeline, the date, the barn, the padlock that Margaret Calloway had carried, and placed herself, the right away, the hours Eliza spent alone in November cold with an untreated wound. He said Ruth Sayers's name and held up her statement and said she was present in the gallery and available to the court. He said Ada Nichols's name and held up her statement and watched Galt's careful face go very still. Then he held up the three affidavits, Margaret's, Ada's, Frances's, and read aloud the two phrases that appeared word for word in all three, and he said in the same measured tone he'd used for everything else. These affidavits were not written by the individuals who signed them. They were drafted by opposing counsel and signed under his direction. The court should know that Ada Nichols has provided a sworn statement to this effect, which I am entering into the record. The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when something that everyone has been talking around is finally said plainly, and the plain saying of it rearranges the air. She heard it in the gallery, not sound exactly, more the quality of held breath. Galt was on his feet. Objection, procedure, the language of a lawyer buying time while his mind worked. Mercer held up one hand without looking up from the papers Creech had submitted, and Galt stopped. Mercer read. He read for a long time. The room waited. Margaret in the front row was still, the absolute stillness of a person who is working very hard to show nothing. James Calloway. Beside her had the look of a man who had paid for a specific outcome and was watching it become uncertain. Mercer set the papers down and looked at Galt. Counsel, he said, I'm going to need you to address the affidavit discrepancy before we proceed. What followed was 40 minutes of legal exchange that Eliza followed closely and understood imperfectly, but she understood enough. Galt was managing, not winning. He offered explanations that Mercer received with the expression of a man noting their inadequacy without yet deciding what to do about it. Creech was patient, responsive, never overplaying. Gerald Sayers, when called upon, spoke for 6 minutes in the flat, precise voice of a man who sat on a town council and understood the weight of formal proceedings, and what he said was brief and complete and left no room for an alternative interpretation. Ruth was called. She sat in the chair beside Mercer's bench and answered Creech's questions in a voice that was quiet but steady. And when Galt cross-examined her, she looked at him directly and did not change her account in any particular, because it was true, and true things don't change when you look at them from different angles, which is the one reliable advantage truth has over its alternatives. When Ruth stepped down, she walked back to the gallery and sat beside her father, and Gerald Sayers put his hand briefly over hers, a small gesture that Eliza saw from the table, and that told her something about what it cost Ruth to do what she'd done, and also about the particular grace of being someone's child in the way that Ruth, complicated and imperfect and late in coming to it, still was. Then Cole was called. He walked to the chair and sat down and answered Creech's questions about the night in the barn. What he'd heard, what he'd found, what he'd done. In the same plain, undecorated way he did everything, and the plainness of it was more convincing than any performance would have been because it was simply what had happened, and it sounded like what had happened. When Galt cross-examined him, trying to establish a character narrative, the man who'd threatened a surveyor, the man who'd driven his wife away, the man who lived alone beyond the hills for reasons that suggested themselves, Cole met each question with the same level attention he gave everything and answered what was asked without adding anything that wasn't. And Galt, who needed emotion to work with and was not getting any, eventually stopped. Then Eliza. She sat in the chair that Ruth had sat in, and Creech walked her through it, and she answered everything. And when Galt cross-examined her, probing at her lack of family, her short time in Red Hollow, the 2 nights at Cole's cabin, she answered those too, clearly and without apology. And she did not look at Margaret while she did it, not because she was afraid to, but because Margaret was no longer the relevant thing in the room. Mercer recessed for an hour. The gallery talked in low voices. Eliza sat at the table with Creech and Cole and drank water from the cup a court attendant brought and waited with the particular quality of waiting that is not anxious because the anxiety has exhausted itself, and what's left is just the bare fact of not knowing yet. Cole beside her said quietly, "Whatever he decides today, the East Pasture deed is recorded and documented, and Calloway can't change that. I want you to know that the land is settled regardless. Today won't change it." She looked at him. "You're telling me not to weigh today too heavily. I'm telling you that some things are already decided even when it doesn't feel like it." He looked at the empty judge's chair. "We built what we built. It holds." Mercer came back. He settled at his bench and put on his reading glasses and looked at the room over them for a moment. The particular look of a judge who has made a decision and is composing how to render it. He ruled in 40 sentences, which she counted later without meaning to, the way you sometimes count things when you are trying to hold a moment still. The civil complaint filed by James Calloway against Eliza Harper was dismissed. The court found insufficient grounds. The evidence demonstrated that the presence of the plaintiff on the property in question was not voluntary, and that the injury sustained was the result of deliberate action by third parties. The affidavits submitted in support of the complaint were formally noted as irregular and referred to the Bar Association for review of the process by which they were obtained. Ruth Sayers's account and Ada Nichols's statement were entered into the permanent record. On the property matter, the adverse possession claim filed against Cole Varden's East Pasture was denied. The original deed was upheld. The creek access remained, as it had always legally been, Cole Varden's. The room took this in. Margaret Calloway stood up from the gallery bench and walked out before Mercer had finished the final sentence, which told Eliza more about Margaret's character than anything else she'd observed, that even at the end, the instinct was to exit rather than to face what the room had decided. James Calloway sat for a moment after his daughter left, alone on the bench with Galt leaning down to speak quietly in his ear, and his face in that moment was not the face of a villain, which she had sometimes made him in her mind, but the face of an old man who had wanted something for a long time and had finally been told he was not going to get it, and there was something human in that, even now. Creech shook her hand and then Cole's and said he would be in touch about the bar referral, and that he expected Galt would have a very uncomfortable winter. Cole thanked him in the brief, complete way he thanked people, the way that didn't overstate but didn't shortchange either. Gerald Sayers crossed the room and shook Cole's hand and said, "Long overdue," and Cole nodded and said, "Thank you for your daughter," which Eliza thought was exactly the right thing to say. Ruth found her near the door. She was wearing her coat already and had clearly been deciding whether to stop or keep moving and had decided to stop. "How are you?" she said. "Glad," Eliza said, which was the simple truth. "How are you?" Ruth considered it. "Scared, relieved. My father's not angry with me, which I didn't." She stopped, started differently. "It went better than I thought it would. With him. He said the most important thing wasn't that I'd made a mistake. It was what I did after." She looked at her hands. "I don't know if Margaret will ever speak to me again." "Would that be a loss?" Ruth looked up. Then the first real, unguarded expression Eliza had ever seen from her crossed her face, something wry and exhausted and honest. "No," she said. "Probably not." They went out into the December afternoon, the four of them, Creech peeling off at his office, Gerald Sayers and Ruth turning toward the Sayers house on the north end of town, and Eliza and Cole stood on the street for a moment in the cold light with the courthouse behind them. "Come on," he said. "It's a long drive back." They drove north on the county road in the cart, the same road she'd driven 12 days ago with her trunk and her blankets and the whole town watching. The hills were the same gray-brown. The creek ran low and clear. The light was going the way it went in December, fast and without sentiment, the sky darkening from the east while the west held a last strip of pale gold above the ridgeline. Neither of them spoke much on the drive. There wasn't much that needed saying that hadn't been said or would be better said soon, and they had gotten good at this. The two of them in a shared quiet that didn't ask anything of you, that simply accepted what was there. At the cabin, Cole saw to the horse, and she started a fire, which had become her task in the 12 days she'd been there, because she woke earlier and the mornings were cold, and it was simply useful. She had the fire going by the time he came in, stomping the cold from his boots, and she had coffee started and the lamp lit against the early dark. He came to the fire and stood with his hands out toward it, and she stood beside him, and they were quiet together for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. He was looking at the fire, not at her, in the way he looked at things he was thinking carefully about. His hands were no longer held out toward the warmth. He'd lowered them, and one of them, she noticed, was close to hers without quite touching. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that before I say it. I've been alone long enough that I've lost the habit of saying things out loud before I've finished thinking them through. I usually wait until something is finished before I bring it out." He paused. "This isn't finished. I'm aware of that." She looked at his profile in the firelight, the jaw that needed shaving, the watchful eyes that were not watching anything right now, were simply turned inward. She thought about a man who had spent 9 years in a silence that the town had decided was hostility, who had built his furniture with his own hands and kept his documents in order and waited with a patience that was not resignation but something more active and more costly, the patience of someone who had decided what they were not willing to give up. "Say it anyway," she said. He turned and looked at her then, and whatever the careful guardedness was that he wore in the world, it was not there right now. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not because of the hearing or the housing or any of the practical reasons that brought you here. I'd like you to stay because the cabin is, because things are different with you in it. I'm different." He stopped. "That's not finished either. I don't have the end of it yet." She thought about 23 years old and a trunk on a cart on the main street of a town that hadn't known her, and everything she'd carried into Red Hollow that had nothing to do with baggage, and everything to do with the long accumulated weight of being a person who hadn't found a place that held. She thought about the photograph in the drawer and what it had meant that he'd put it there. She thought about letters about red-tailed hawks and fence lines and the small, ordinary things that had traveled 4 miles in each direction between two people who had not yet named what they were doing but had been doing it for months. "You don't need the end of it," she said. "I'll stay." His hand moved and covered hers, and she let it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. What happened after that was not a sudden transformation. Small towns don't transform suddenly. They shift, they adjust, they rearrange themselves around new information the way water works around a changed bank, gradually and without announcement. The story of the hearing spread through Red Hollow the way all stories spread there, fast and modified by each telling, but the core of it was durable enough that the modifications couldn't change its essential shape. Eliza Harper had been wronged and had documented it and had stood in a county courthouse and had won. Cole Varden had opened a barn door in the middle of the night and carried a hurt woman out and had been telling the truth about his land for 4 years. These were facts, and facts in small towns eventually settle into place, even when it takes them a while. Margaret Calloway did not disappear. People with her family's money and standing don't disappear from small towns, they reconfigure. She was cooler, more careful, and the particular social machinery she'd been running for years ran with less confidence, because it turned out that its power had depended partly on the assumption that people would not push back, and that assumption had been disproved in a courthouse on a December afternoon, and you couldn't quite go back to the way a room felt before that. Ada Nichols married her banker's son's son in the spring and moved to the county seat, and was not, as far as Eliza could tell, particularly missed. Frances drifted in Ada's wake. Ruth stayed in Red Hollow and sat across from Eliza at the dry goods counter one afternoon in February and said she'd joined a committee organizing the spring social, and the way she said it, carefully, hopefully, made Eliza understand that Ruth was beginning the long process of building something different from what she'd had, and that this was going to take time and would probably not be smooth, and that she was going to do it anyway. "Good," Eliza told her, and meant it. Pratt gave her a raise in January. He did it without ceremony, adjusting her weekly amount and noting it in the accounts. And when she looked up, he was already back in the stockroom, and she understood that this was his way of saying something he didn't have language for, and she let it stand as said. Cole came into town more often that winter, not a great deal more. He was still Cole Varden, still a man who found the company of his own land preferable to most of what Red Hollow had to offer, but more than twice a year. He came in on Fridays sometimes, when she was finishing at Pratt's, and they drove back north together in the last of the afternoon light, and she learned the specific quality of December light and January light and February light over the hills along that road, and the way the creek looked at different water levels, and which fence posts were newer and which ones Cole had been meaning to replace for 2 seasons and kept not getting to. She learned the ranch the way you learn a place when you're actually living in it, not as a landscape, but as a system, a set of relationships between the land and the work and the weather and the animals and the person who kept all of it running. She learned that Cole's mornings started earlier than she'd realized, that he had opinions about rope quality that were surprisingly intense, that he kept a ledger of his own that was as methodical as anything she'd produced at Pratt's. She learned that he was better at fixing things than asking for help with them, which was a limitation she could name because she shared it, and naming it in each other made it not fixed but visible, which was at least a start. They were married in March. It was not a large affair, which suited them both. Creech was there. Gerald and Ruth Sayers were there. Pratt was there, solid and suited and visibly uncomfortable but present, which was his form of warmth, and she received it as such. 3 of Cole's neighbors came, men she'd met briefly over the winter, ranchers from the hills north of his land who had watched Cole's legal fight with quiet attention and had revised their estimation of him over the years in the way neighbors do when the evidence accumulates. They sat in the small courthouse anteroom where Mercer had agreed to perform the civil ceremony, and they were decent company. Cole stood beside her and said the words in his plain voice, and looked at her with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, without decoration, without performance, and she said her own words back to him and meant them the way she meant the things that didn't require rehearsal. Afterward, standing outside in the March cold with the first suggestion of something warmer on the way. Not yet, but coming, the way spring came to that valley, slowly and then suddenly. Creech shook Cole's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required and said, "About time." Cole said, "Yes." That was the whole exchange, and it was sufficient. She thought, standing there in the cold with Cole's arm against her shoulder and the small gathering of people who had, in one way or another, stood for something real in the months that had led to this moment. She thought about what a life gets built from. Not the big decisions, usually, not the dramatic choices, the moments that feel like turning points when you're in them. It's the smaller things, the choice to write 3 pages of documentation the morning after a locked barn, the choice to go downstairs for supper, the choice to say you don't have to, even when you don't say it loudly enough, the choice to slide a note under a door that says simply, "Come when you need to." The accumulation of those things, patient and daily and mostly unwitnessed, is what actually makes a life different from what it would have been. She had come to Red Hollow, 23 years old and alone, and carrying the long-trained certainty that belonging was not a thing available to her, that it was a door that had been locked before she arrived, and she would spend her life walking its perimeter without ever finding a way in. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong in ways that required her to be locked in a cold barn and rescued by the town's designated monster, and to spend 2 months fighting a slow legal battle. She wasn't sure she could win before she understood she was wrong, which was not a straightforward path to being corrected. But it was the path she'd had, and she'd taken it, and here was where it had come out. Here was Cole Varden, who had been called dangerous for 9 years by people who had never spoken to him, who had kept his documentation and his patience and his essential decency intact through all of it at a cost she was only beginning to understand fully. He was not easy. He was not without the damage that years of imposed solitude leave in a person. He was not the man who had been described to her before she'd met him, but neither was he some corrected version of that man. He was a different man altogether, the real one, the one that existed in the space between what people said and what was actually true, and she thought that was the thing worth fighting for, always, the real thing, in the space between the story and the fact. The old barn on the east edge of the property. She passed it sometimes, crossing to check the fence line or coming back from the creek. The doors were open now. Cole had taken the chain off in January and left the doors back against the siding. She'd asked him why. "Because there's no reason to lock it," he said. "Never was." She had thought about that for a long time afterward. About how many things in a life get locked for reasons that made sense once and don't anymore, and about how it takes a particular kind of attention, not to the lock, but to the reason, to notice when the reason has stopped being true and the lock can come off. The doors stayed open through March and into the spring that followed, and when the light was long in the evenings and the hills had gone from gray-brown to something greener, she would sometimes stand at the cabin door and look east and see them from a distance. Those wide doors open to whatever the day was bringing, letting in the light without condition or restriction, and she thought that this was, as plainly as she could state it, what it felt like to have found the thing she'd come looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Not rescue. Not arrival at some permanent safe place where difficulty could not follow. Just this. A person who chose her with full knowledge of what the choice cost, and a place that was hers to help build, and the daily work of building it together with someone who understood that the building was the point. That was enough. That was, she had decided, more than enough. Outside, Cole had been watching for months. The one with the tilt in its left wing when it banked, cut across the late afternoon sky above the west pasture, and Cole pointed at it from where he was mending the fence, and she saw it from the doorway, and they were too far apart to speak, but she raised one hand and he raised his back, and that small wordless exchange was the whole of what needed to be said.